At the beginning of no contact, silence rarely feels like emptiness to an avoidant person. It feels like relief. The emotional pressure that once existed in the relationship suddenly disappears, and in its place comes a sense of control. There are no expectations to respond, no difficult conversations to navigate, and no need to explain feelings they were never fully comfortable expressing. This silence creates a psychological shift. On the surface, life appears calmer. Internally, the avoidant mind begins to recalibrate. The nervous system, previously activated by emotional closeness, now settles into distance. What feels like peace is often just emotional detachment taking effect. On the other side, the person left in silence experiences something very different. Confusion starts to build. Questions arise. Why did it become so quiet? Did I do something wrong? Alongside confusion, there is often hope. Hope that the silence is temporary, that things will return to how they were before. This contrast creates emotional imbalance. While one side experiences distance as freedom, the other experiences it as uncertainty. But beneath both reactions, something similar is happening: adjustment. Both minds are trying to make sense of absence, just in different ways. For the avoidant, this phase can feel like regaining stability. For the other person, it feels like emotional withdrawal. Neither experience is fully accurate in its interpretation at this stage, because clarity has not yet formed. What makes this phase so powerful is its stillness. No arguments, no closure, just silence that feels heavy in meaning but light in action. And in that quiet space, both people begin to tell themselves different stories about what this distance really means. As days pass in no contact, two completely different internal processes begin to unfold. On your side, the mind starts searching for meaning. It replays moments, conversations, and small details that suddenly feel more important than they did before. You begin to analyze tone, timing, and behavior, trying to find a hidden explanation that can make sense of the silence. This search is not just curiosity, it is the mind's attempt to create closure where none was given. Thoughts become cyclical. One memory leads to another. Questions repeat themselves in different forms, but the core remains the same. What went wrong, and why did it end this way? In this state, the absence of clarity becomes emotionally louder than the relationship itself ever was. The mind fills gaps with assumptions, often swinging between hope and doubt. On the other side, the avoidant individual begins to experience the same distance very differently. Instead of searching for meaning, they begin to settle into emotional separation. The initial relief they felt at the start of no contact slowly turns into stability. Their mind starts reinforcing the idea that distance is necessary for balance, space, or self-preservation. Emotional intensity, which once felt overwhelming, now feels distant and manageable simply because it is no longer present. This creates a fundamental imbalance in emotional processing. While one person is moving deeper into emotional engagement through memory and reflection, the other is moving further into detachment through distance and rationalization. The same silence that feels heavy and unresolved to one person feels structured and necessary to the other. Neither experience is fully conscious in its complexity. The mind on both sides is protecting itself in different ways, one through connection, the other through separation. But because these protective responses move in opposite directions, understanding between them naturally weakens over time. What makes this phase particularly difficult is that nothing is actively happening, yet everything is changing internally. One mind is trying to restore emotional connection through meaning, the other is reinforcing emotional distance through absence, and in that gap between searching and withdrawing, clarity becomes harder for both sides to reach. As time continues without communication, the absence slowly starts to take shape in both lives. At first, it seems like space, something manageable, even intentional. But over time, silence stops feeling neutral. It begins to carry weight. It becomes noticeable in routines, in habits, and in the small moments where the presence of the other person once existed. On your side, emotional withdrawal often feels like confusion before it becomes acceptance. There are moments in the day where something reminds you of them, a place, a sound, a time of day, and your mind instinctively reaches for a connection that is no longer active. You might not express it outwardly, but internally, the absence starts to interrupt your normal flow of thoughts. Even simple routines begin to feel slightly different, as if something familiar is missing but not fully acknowledged yet. Sleep patterns may shift, focus may weaken, and emotionally, there is a quiet discomfort that grows in the background. It is not always intense, but it is persistent. The mind starts adjusting around the gap, trying to normalize something that still feels unresolved. On the other side, the avoidant begins to experience a different form of emotional shift. What once felt like relief and control slowly turns into subtle awareness of distance. Life appears stable on the surface, but silence is no longer completely unnoticed. There are moments where emotional detachment feels strong and moments where it feels unexpectedly empty. However, instead of moving toward emotional engagement, the avoidant mind often reinforces distance as stability. It interprets space as safety, even when discomfort begins to appear underneath. Rather than revisiting emotional depth, it leans further into separation, routines, and distractions that maintain control over feelings. This creates a quiet imbalance. Two people, both affected but processing the same absence in opposite directions. One moves toward emotional reflection, the other toward emotional restriction. Neither side is fully at peace, but both are trying to adapt in their own way. What makes this stage complex is that nothing is said, yet everything is felt. The emotional withdrawal does not arrive as a single moment. It develops slowly, reshaping perception, memory, and response. And in that slow shift, silence becomes more than absence. It becomes a force that quietly changes both sides without needing a single word. When you stop reacting, something subtle but important begins to change in the emotional dynamic. The urge to seek answers, to decode silence, or to reach for clarity starts to lose its intensity. At first, this feels unnatural, almost uncomfortable, because your mind is used to movement, checking, wondering, interpreting. But in this stage, you begin to interrupt that cycle. Instead of directing energy outward, attention slowly turns inward. You start noticing your own thoughts rather than chasing theirs. The emotional noise that once felt constant begins to settle, not because the situation has changed, but because your response to it is changing. And this shift is where the power dynamic quietly begins to move. Emotional dependency weakens not through force, but through withdrawal of reaction. When you no longer engage with uncertainty in the same way, the situation loses its ability to control your emotional state. The need for immediate answers fades. The urgency to be understood or acknowledged starts to lose its grip. What remains is space, mental space, emotional space, and a growing sense of awareness. On the outside, nothing may appear different. There is still silence, still distance, still unanswered questions. But internally, something stabilizes. You are no longer emotionally pulled in every direction by absence. The highs and lows begin to soften. Instead of being consumed by interpretation, you start observing patterns more clearly. This is also where the dynamic begins to shift without confrontation. No arguments, no explanations, no final conversations, just a gradual change in emotional participation. When one side stops reacting, the balance that once depended on emotional response begins to dissolve. Over time, silence no longer triggers the same intensity. The mind learns that not every gap needs to be filled. Not every absence needs to be explained. This doesn't mean the feelings disappear instantly, but their control over you weakens. What makes this stage significant is its quiet nature. There is no visible resolution, yet internally, a restructuring is happening. You are no longer operating from emotional urgency, but from observation. And in that shift, from reaction to awareness, the emotional dependency that once defined the connection begins to lose its authority, allowing a more grounded sense of self to slowly take its place. As your reactions begin to fade, the emotional landscape of the connection starts to shift again. What once felt predictable in its distance begins to carry a different kind of weight. The absence is still there, but now it is no longer being actively filled by your responses, your attention, or your emotional engagement. On the avoidant side, this change is not always immediately conscious. It does not arrive as a clear realization or a defined thought. Instead, it appears in subtle emotional signals, moments of quiet awareness, brief interruptions in routine thinking, or a sense of something no longer being present in the background of their day. The space that once felt comfortable can slowly begin to feel unfamiliar. Where there was once emotional distance that felt safe and controlled, there may now be a faint sense of tension. Not overwhelming, but noticeable enough to register internally. The mind begins to recognize that the emotional environment has changed, even if it cannot fully define how or why. This is where reflection often starts to emerge in fragments. A memory may surface without intention. A thought may linger a little longer than usual. The absence of your reactions removes a layer of emotional structure they were indirectly accustomed to, and in that removal, awareness begins to form. However, this awareness does not always translate into action. Instead of moving toward reconnection, the avoidant mind often processes this shift internally. It may interpret the discomfort as something temporary, something that will settle on its own. At the same time, it begins to notice that the emotional intensity they once expected is no longer being activated. This creates a quiet contrast. The distance that once provided relief now carries a different emotional tone. It is no longer just separation, it is the presence of absence itself. And in that distinction, reflection becomes more likely, even if it remains unspoken. What makes this stage complex is its subtlety. Nothing dramatic happens. There is no sudden realization or emotional confession. Instead, it is a slow recognition that the emotional pattern has changed. Your withdrawal from reaction does not create immediate change in behavior, but it does alter the emotional balance they were previously operating within. And in that altered balance, the absence begins to feel different, not louder, not more intense, but more noticeable in its quiet persistence. At this stage, the connection quietly reaches a turning point beneath the surface. Nothing dramatic happens outwardly, yet internally, something important begins to take shape. The emotional patterns that once repeated automatically are no longer flowing in the same way. There is a subtle interruption in the cycle that both sides, in their own ways, begin to feel. On your side, the focus is no longer driven by urgency. The need for immediate answers or emotional resolution has started to soften. Instead of constantly engaging with uncertainty, there is more observation. You begin to notice not only what happened, but also how it affected you. This shift creates space for clarity that was not accessible during emotional intensity. On the other side, the avoidant experience also begins to shift, though differently. The distance that once felt structured and familiar may now carry moments of internal questioning. Not necessarily about the entire connection, but about certain emotional gaps that are harder to ignore. What was once easily dismissed as distance is better can now feel less absolute. This is where the critical decision begins forming, not as a single thought, but as a gradual internal direction. Either deeper awareness slowly develops, where both emotional impact and personal responsibility start to be acknowledged, or the pattern reinforces itself, and emotional distance becomes the default response once again. What makes this stage significant is the resistance to old patterns. Previously, reactions followed a familiar script, one person reaching, the other withdrawing. But now, that automatic movement begins to weaken. The emotional rhythm is no longer as predictable as it once was. In this space, silence carries different meanings for both sides. For one, it represents clarity in progress.